So beating cancer with food. I thought I'd give you a little bit about my bio so you know where I'm coming from, just my background. I went to Yale Medical School. I got University of Iowa residency in internal medicine, so I'm board certified in internal medicine. My wife was a clergywoman, and so I thought I was going to start a temporary job doing emergency medicine for a couple of years while she was at a church in Iowa City. And before you know it, 30 years later, I've been the medical director of St. Luke's ER for 18 years and the director of Sinai's ER for about 10 years. But about 10 years ago, I started saying, wait a minute, we're doing this backwards. And I said, it's time we start curing disease and really getting to the real source of disease. And Mick Turkle was very gracious to me at Aurora, and he sort of put me into the role of being Aurora's wellness teacher. And for about 7 years, I was traveling, while I was doing emergency medicine half-time, I traveled the length and breadth of Aurora and I taught wellness. And I got more and more involved in it, and so then I went off and got my board certification in anti-aging, and I left Aurora in 2012 and opened up my clinic over by Ruby Isle, for those who know this area. And then 18 months ago, the University of South Florida started the first integrative cancer program at a medical school in America. And so I'm in their first class, and they're on module 7 now. They're doing 4 a year, and they've just done module 7. I've finished module 6 online. I haven't seen any 7 yet. So I'm about 6 weeks behind. But they're basically bringing forward all the different ideas around America. So what you're going to hear is about 6 modules all compressed into an hour. So I'll be talking at 8,000 words a minute, and please listen carefully. No, I have trouble not to do that. But I'm going to give you some 50,000-foot ideas so that you can get an overview of what makes sense of what's going on in cancer. But it's also recognizing so we can go a different way. So my object is to say, how does cancer get started? Oh, how many people here have cancer? If you're willing, put your hands up. Okay, do you know that's the wrong answer? Everybody here should put your hands up. Every one of you here, if there's anybody here who's under 40, that you may not have cancer. But for the rest of us, if I take out every man's prostate gland and look at it, you have cancer. If I take a woman's breast off and look at it in 1,000 different slices, I can find cancer. And so you're going to hear in this talk, cancer isn't just a disease that gets started at age 60 or 70 or 80. It really started, we're going to go into that. So is our current system working? Some basic science about how it develops, how to reduce those risks, if we can figure out how to reduce those risks, and can I eat and do something to change that, and some specific food ideas. So if we can get through all that in 1 hour, I'll be real proud of myself. Okay. Well, first of all, if you ask people what causes cancer, almost everybody says if we poll people, Americans will tell you that about 80% of cancer is caused by their genes. My mother had breast cancer, therefore you're nervous. Or my mother, my aunt, and my 2 sisters had breast cancer, so now I'm really nervous. Or my father had prostate cancer, or we tend to do that, and we attribute it to genes. This is the real story. Little alcohol, whole lot of tobacco, some infections, some environmental stuff. Diet and lifestyle is as big as tobacco. And tobacco is pretty wicked. And let's see, where's genetics? So BRCA gene, for example, for breast cancer is probably about 2% of breast cancer, only 2%. And what's totally fascinating about BRCA gene is in the 1940s, it would express it as cancer about 40% of the time. And now, 70 years later, it turns up as cancer 85% of the time. So what made a gene that worked 40% of the time turn into something that worked 85%? That's what we're talking about tonight. Something's changed. All right? So the war on cancer ain't going so hot. We're not doing a good job. We're not dying no fewer of us are dying from it, and we're not saving lives anymore. Huh? If you talk to the American Cancer Society, they say, oh no, we've taken 30% off we're 30% down on cancer. And so then you say, wait, help me with this. So there's a guy by the name of Brawley who wrote a book called How We Do Harm. I'm going to refer to him in just a minute. You'll see his slide. But who's the president of the American Cancer Society. So he's not an insignificant character in American cancer. This is one of his slides. He says, here's the 5-year survival data for prostate cancer. And let's go back to 1989. And we see for stage 4, we have a 30% survival for stage 4 prostate cancer. This is men's number 1 cancer. All right, let's move forward 20 years, and we go all the way up to 30.6. Wow, we went from 30 to 30.6. If my kids tried to tell me that was significant, or if any of you are a teacher here and had a student tried to say that was a meaningful change, you'd say, are you kidding me? That's no change at all. And just in case the women thought they were being left out, let's do the same comparison for breast cancer, the number 1 cancer for women. And stage 4, Caucasian women, 23% survival, 5 years. 20 years later, 23.3%. We haven't made one diddly bit of difference. We haven't made one diddly bit of difference. Yet everybody has an anecdotal story of somebody whose life was saved. At least that's how they interpret it, because it's such an emotional topic. They feel like their life was saved by a mammogram or something else. So just, this is a slide I should put in here. Science News 2 weeks ago published a report done by the National Cancer Institute, what they said about mammograms. And if you ask American women, how many women out of 1,000 are lives saved by mammograms? And you know what their answer is? So 10% of American women get breast cancer. So out of 1,000, 100 women are going to get breast cancer. So how many of them their lives are going to be saved? And American women will tell you in randomized questionnaires or polls that 50 lives per 1,000 are saved by mammography. You know what the real answer is? 1. You save 1 life per 1,000, and the problem is, you know what all that mammography does? You treat 3 unnecessary people for breast cancer who didn't have it, and you, with all the extra radiation, you cause 1 breast cancer. So societies that do mammography versus societies that don't have the same outcome. If you want to find your breast cancer, your best protection is for you to examine it yourself, because cancer is always hot and warm, and you find a part that's a little bit warm. You go, oh, that's weird, and then you feel it, and you say, that's not right, that doesn't. So the majority of people who are found early find it because they find it themselves. And if you, depending on your doctor to find it, he doesn't know you, or she doesn't know you. So you just aren't going to get it close. So what really causes cancer? So here's the summary talk. So for those who are still awake, remember this side, and then you don't need to listen to the rest of it. So I figure I'd list it up front early like a good preacher, say it once, and then you can say it twice. There's likely many causes. The interaction of an abnormal cell and its environment with a variety of long-term stimulants. And I'm going to go through that variety in the next hour. And there's an accumulation of dysregulation, an accumulation of ability to adapt to those changes. So the cancer looks around and says, okay, what tools have I got inside my DNA here, and what can I use to adapt? And then you have damage to the mitochondria of a cell, and I'm going to talk about this. This may be the common thing. And that can't be repaired, so cancer loses the ability to burn glucose efficiently, so it's got to find abundant glucose. And those cells can't survive in this. They got lots of sugar. So in a high sugar environment, they may get more mutations that allow them to infect macrophages that are meant to kill them, and then the macrophage knows how to travel places, so they use the tools of the macrophage to travel. So then the cancer starts traveling and spreading around and looking for food. And then that's what causes it to spread. So cancer cells then merge with killer white cells, and that teaches them how to spread. So off they go. So who's heard about Otto Warburg before? Okay, good. 1929, actually 1931 he got the Nobel Prize. 1929, he made the observation that cancer can live without oxygen. Cancer cells can live without oxygen. Now, it takes 80 years for us to figure out exactly what he's talking about, so we're going to get back to that because that's the most fascinating part of the story, is what does that mean if cancer cells can't live? He didn't realize what huge implications this has. But what he did get was a Nobel Prize. Okay. But that turns out to be the key to cancer, and we didn't know it until about 2005. And what he found out, what he realized, is that cancer cells are, he didn't know this, but we did in 2005, and I'm going to refer back to a couple times. Cancer cells are bad at burning glucose all the way down to carbon dioxide and water. All they can do is burn glucose by cutting it in half and getting 2 ATP, whereas a healthy cell can burn it all the way down to carbon dioxide and water and get 38 ATP. So a healthy cell gets 38, a cancer cell only gets 2. So a cancer cell has to have a boatload of glucose to make up for that inefficiency. All right? So here we go. And if you want to get fancy, you can look at it like this and go, I could spend the whole hour talking about this, but that's what this talks about, so we're going to skip that. Simple conclusion. The more glucose you eat, the better chance you give glucose inside you, cancer inside you to multiply. The more fuel you provide to cancer, the better the chance the cells have. Because think of cancer cells it's like you hanging on the top of the 17th floor bank building. You're on the what's it called now? It's not Bank One. What's the big tall building downtown? First Wisconsin now? US Bank. Do you work down there? Oh, okay. Imagine you're on the top of the US Bank building and you're hanging on by your fingernails, and there's somebody up on top there stepping on your fingernails. Those cancer cells are hanging on by their fingernails. They can just barely make it. And they can make it only if they can get enough glucose. So the more glucose we give them, you're giving them some margin. The glucose you take away from them, they're losing that margin. So if you are slightly diabetic, you're making an environment in which early cancer cells should starve and die, but they make it by the skin of their teeth as they adapt. Okay? So the more weight you gain, the higher your glucose, because you're becoming insulin resistant and diabetic. All right? Being overweight and having a slightly high glucose makes you more at risk for getting cancer. And we're going to go to the exact details of that. So I'll have a half-pound double deluxe bacon steel burger, please. Would you like chemotherapy with that? Okay. So here's some basic biology facts. A cancer that's this big, that's something you can find when you feel your breast, or a doctor can feel on a prostate exam. I can't feel it on your tummy when I'm feeling your kidney, but on your thyroid I could feel a nodule in something that's the size of a marble. A marble is 1 billion cells, and a billion is roughly 2 times 2 times 2, 60 times. So it's 2 to the 60th doublings. So a marble, which is something you can find, is 60 doublings. Okay? A doubling time can be a variety of lengths of time. If a doubling time is 9 months, that's 45 years. If I can get your prostate cancer to double once every 9 months, you're going to get cancer 45 years from now. Too bad. By that point, my 45 years from now, my contract is long up. Okay? But if your doubling time is 1 month, you're getting cancer in 5 years. Can I get you to change the doubling time of your prostate cancer, your breast cancer, from 1 month to 2 months to 6 months? That's what should be the objective. So in 1900, how long did people live when they were given the diagnosis of insulin-dependent diabetes? In 1900, how long did people live when they knew they had insulin-dependent diabetes? And the answer would be? Longer. 1 month. Oh yeah, you had insulin-dependent diabetes? We didn't have insulin then. So it was a death sentence. It was like saying you have brain cancer today. Now, is there anybody here who doesn't know somebody with diabetes? Everybody's got diabetes. All right? There's lots of folks on insulin. It's a chronic disease we've learned to manage. Now granted, you may be having more cancer with diabetes, but at least it's a disease we've learned to manage. And so people will live with diabetes for 40 years. My belief is that's where we should be going and saying, how can we change cancer biology to make it a disease if we can get the doubling time to be longer? But cancer doesn't start at age 45 or 60 or 75. It really starts at 2 and 12 and 21, depending on your environment. So these are the kind of graphs you see. As we get older, we have, first of all, more cancer showing up and more people dying from it. Okay? This is what you see. And so it looks like cancer starts at age 50 and 60 and 70. But we're going to talk about that. So what are the potential environmental risks for cancer? Well, some of them are lack of vitamin D, hepatitis C viruses, environmental toxins, insulin levels. Insulin's a potent growth factor for cancer. Animal proteins, lack of plant phytonutrients, total calories. Those are all some of the risk factors. But for example, here is a graph of UVB exposure and colorectal cancer. So I can show you, here's the least UVB light, because the Northeast is the part of the country that's got the most clouds and rain and cold long winter, whereas these folks out in the mountains have more sunny days and higher altitude. Okay? When I first saw this graph, you know, anybody heard my joke on this one before? Okay. When I first saw this graph, you know what I thought it meant? Democrats get colon cancer. Sorry, isn't that a pretty good joke right now? You know, we're all so stressed out and beaten up by these stupid politicians. But this is the graph for UVB versus colon cancer. The less sunlight you get, the more colon cancer you get. All right? But in fact, you can do that for almost any cancer. Almost any cancer has that same pattern, about a 20 to 30%. So living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, your chance of breast cancer is about 30% higher than if you lived in Houston. Oh, heck, let's do the next, Dan, let's just do the next talk down at Guadalajara or something, you know. But here, for example, was a study done at Creighton University about 5 years ago by Dr. Lappy, published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, where in a study that they were going to get 40 and 50-year-old women and give them vitamin D and calcium for 30 years to see if they wouldn't break their hip when they turned 70. And they were given $20-some million for the study, and after 5 years, they terminated the study, and they had the integrity to terminate the study. If you're a college professor in medical school and you've got $20 million, you know what that's called? Tenure. Right? If you terminate a study, what are you doing? Putting yourself out of a job. So you don't do it lightly, right? So what did these guys do? They terminated the study early and sent the money back because the women getting vitamin D had 76% less cancer than the women who weren't getting it. Now this study's been criticized now, saying, well, that wasn't the primary outcome and it was only a small number, and there were a certain, it was only a tiny number here and it wasn't all that many. It was only 2 of these and 3 of those and 1 of those. That's not enough to be statistically significant. And I say, horse hockey. Of course it was significant. Now the question is, what is the placebo and what's the right amount? And what's the right amount and what's the range of what to be healthy? We'll talk about that. But let's look at, for example, here's breast cancer mortality in North America. Look how many breast cancer patients we have in North America. Look how many breast cancer patients we get in Central Africa. Ratio of about 10 to 1. Okay? Anybody want to live in Central Africa? Okay. They didn't put Ebola on that list, did they? Okay. But then let's go to China. Let's look at hepatocellular cancer and look at China versus North America. Again, that's 5 to 37, a 7-fold difference. And that's probably because almost everybody in China has hepatitis B virus. And chronic hepatitis B virus, which gets passed on at birth, is a strong risk factor for liver cancer. So we see hugely different ranges all around the world. So here's the general cancer mortality for US 2004. And again, you see the vitamin D effect. Is there anybody here who's not taking vitamin D? Please start, particularly right now because it's the beginning of winter and we want your blood level to be about 45 to 50. Okay? What we're finding now for cancer, I think I've got a graph, I'll get to that in a minute. But if you take 60 Africans living in Tanzania precisely on the equator, which means they get 365 days a year, the best sunshine you can get. They don't wear as many clothes as we do. They have a much warmer environment, but they're outdoors quite a lot, but they stay in the shade as much as they can because the sun is hot. But because they have sun year-round, their vitamin D level is typically around 45 to 50, that kind of range. So God designed them to have a level of about 45 to 50. Evolution designed them to be, so I figured that's good enough for them. It's probably good enough for me. African Americans in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, average a vitamin D level of around 12. Caucasians average a vitamin D level of around 22. And I want you to be about 45. African Americans have low vitamin D because pigment in the skin means you have to have more intense sunlight to get the same amount. Knowing that, would you expect, is there more breast cancer in the African American community or in the Caucasian community? No, it's double in the African American community. It's double, and it's twice as bad. The African American community carries a terrible burden of cancer because of that extra. And I believe that's possibly a vitamin D related risk that could be lowered. The problem is it's not just, you can't do it for just 5 years. You need to do it for a whole lifetime to really reduce your risk. But starting at age 50 is still better than not starting at all. Okay? So you're still going to be lowering your risk somewhat. So animal protein. Who's heard about animal protein and cancer risk? Who's heard about Colin Campbell and the China study? Okay? So let's talk a little about Colin Campbell. Colin Campbell had a very interesting experience. He ended up being a professor of nutrition at Cornell University in New York, and he probably was one of the most prominent people who helped craft our first food pyramid. But what he just tried to craft was taken away from him and made into the food that he didn't intend. But Colin Campbell set out to teach the world about how American protein and animal farm products could save people's lives, because it would make you bigger and stronger and healthier. And he went to the Philippines because he was asked to go. In the Philippines, he was asked to study why there was an epidemic of liver cancer in rich folks. And he found out that they were eating an awful lot of moldy peanuts and moldy corn. And there's a mold called aflatoxin. And aflatoxin is why Wisconsin farmers have to dry their corn. Because if it's not dry, we'll get aflatoxin. And the Philippines is a pretty wet place with a lot of moisture. And so they got a lot of mold on their food and a lot of aflatoxin. But it turned out the poor folks are getting aflatoxin just like the rich folks. But the rich folks were eating animal protein and the poor folks weren't. He thought, that's interesting. So he went and got some rats and he fed them aflatoxin. He could make them get cancer. And he gave them a variable amount of animal protein versus vegetable protein. And it turns out he could turn cancer on and off in the rats. He could turn it on by eating more animal protein. He could turn it off by eating less. Okay? Turns out that animal protein has a slightly different mix of amino acids, and some of those amino acids are potent hormonal effects in our body, and they turn on a variety of different hormones. One of them is called IGF insulin 1-like growth factor, that's a potent growth factor for cancer. That's not seen with vegetable protein. So it sort of makes sense what he was talking about. So Colin Campbell got all excited about that and designed the China study and went in the largest public health study done in history and looked at Chinese and their incidence of different cancers and how much animal protein they're eating and whether they had heart disease or not. Now the China study has raised a storm of controversy because in fact people have gone back and looked at it and looked at his data and said, wait a minute, he selectively picked, he had so much data he had to sort of kind of say, oh my gosh, I'm being overwhelmed. He had to pick and choose what he thought he was going to put his priority on. Some people have gone back and looked at his data and said, wait, you left out this data. And a woman by the name of, for example, of Deb Minger has been brilliant at saying there actually is the data on the China study to prove all the same stuff that Colin Campbell thought was animal protein by wheat. The wheat could be causing the same thing. And that's really what explains the difference in the China study. So we're not sure what to make of the China study, but I certainly think that the animal protein has some very interesting phenomenon, and that's something to do with these, and in experimental models you can show that. So for those of you getting my email, I wrote an email about 4 months ago where in fact they went and quantified a relatively good study that showed the difference between animal protein and vegetable protein and its effect on adults as we get older. And if you'd like to get my email, Dan, I don't have a list. If you'd have people copy down on a piece of paper, you could pass that around. Dan's going to pass around a piece of paper. If you print your name neatly, and I'll add you to the email list. Okay. But we do know that animal protein, it raises this regulatory protein called mTOR, and we're going to see mTOR again in a little bit. But the net result is under age 65, eating more than 20% of calories from animals results in 4 times the rate of cancer. That was this email I published about 6 months ago. And if you have a 7% animal protein diet, you have a 70% inhibition of prostate, of 56% inhibition of breast cancer. So do you want to eat animal protein or do you want to eat vegetable protein? Right, you want to eat vegetable protein. So why the dramatic D effect? Let's go back to vitamin D. The role of vitamin D, and nobody seems to understand what vitamin D is. And vitamin D is your maturation hormone. It's the hormone that tells immature stem cells to turn into mature cells. Every living cell on this planet, from plankton in the ocean to humans, uses vitamin D as the signal to mature into a mature cell. That's what vitamin D does. Okay? What's a cancer cell? An immature cell that never grew up. A mature cell does three things. It stops dividing. That doesn't sound like cancer. Do its proper function. Doesn't sound like cancer. Go through natural cell death when it's meant to. Immature cells keep dividing, don't die. So here we have vitamin D, the most preserved hormone in nature, from plankton to humans, universally used as the message for cells to mature into mature cells. And right now we have just had the first day of winter, and we're not going to see sunshine from now until April. And I'm really mad. So please, anybody who's not taking vitamin D, now would be a good time to start. You know, if you aren't taking it, now would be a good time. And I'd take about 20,000 units a week.
D or D3?
Vitamin D3.
D3.
Vitamin D3. So, pop quiz. Vitamin D is the universal hormone that cells burn energy better. True or false?
False.
Thank you. That's false. It makes cells more mature. Now, a more mature cell may burn energy better, but fundamentally its job is to make cells more mature. Okay? Liver cancer is rare around the world. False, because there are a boatload of Chinese. And so there's so many Chinese and they got so much liver cancer. Actually, liver cancer is very common. The most common cancer, risk for cancer is thought to be genetic. True or false?
It's thought.
False. It's most likely environmental, but in fact that's a good trick question.
That was tricky.
That's a trick question.
Right.
Good. Front row's paying attention. Okay. Back row, pick it up a little. All right. So what we're now thinking happens is cancer biology is mostly environment, a little bit of good luck or bad luck, and genes. So I had one of my faculty in my program say, actually having prostate cancer is good luck. I said, what do you mean by that? He says, that means you got to be age 70, because the only person who doesn't have prostate cancer is somebody who died at 30. Okay, fair enough. Because every man over 70 has prostate cancer. So it means you were lucky enough to live that long. The real thing with prostate cancer is there seems to be a dividing line about age 65. If you get prostate cancer before 65, it's a more aggressive disease and you'll probably die from it. If you get it after 65, it's a more indolent disease and you'll probably die from something else. Okay? So let's just look at some of the other things I want you to understand. Let's look at height versus breast cancer risk. I hate this slide. You hate this slide. I hate this slide. Okay? So look what happens. Increasing breast cancer risk with increasing height. This is a bummer. I'm a survivor of 2 cancers so far. I'm right in this. Okay, number 3 is coming up, I'm sure. But look at in Japan, breast cancer early life matters. Relationship between height at 12 years of age with Japanese girls and breast cancer 30 years later. So the taller you are, the more cancer you get. That's because to be taller, you typically have more animal protein, because animal protein grows you stronger and bigger and taller, but it also makes you secrete more insulin-like growth factor, which is a potent growth stimulant for cancer at those early cells. So height has increased an average of 3 inches in the last 150 years. Look what's happening. I don't know what happened here. There must have been a bad war right there or something. And so there's been research done on some people. There are some people who are particularly tiny, and research has been done on them, and they turn out to have missing IGF-1, or she actually is missing. She's got a bunch of hormones missing in her that don't turn on cancer. So here she is, healthy as she can be at 104. So what we think is happening is something about, if height is something about insulin-like growth factor, it's something to do with calories. So what happens about total calories? So let's do some experiments with total calories. Let's take a bunch of rats and see if I can inhibition of induced cancers by a calorie-restricted diet. So here are the folks that simply have all the food they want. Here's the rats that get all the food they want. Here's the rats that have a calorie-restricted diet. You can't make them have cancer. So naturally induced cancers that will show up, okay, these are induced cancers. How about cumulative number of spontaneous cancers in rats with eating as much as they want versus calorie-restricted mice. And again, in calorie-restricted mice, you can't make them have cancer. They won't develop it. Isn't that interesting? Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Do you know what that means for humans? That you should be on about 1,400 calories a day the rest of your life. Anybody want to be on 1,400 calories a day the rest of your life? I like food. Right. So what we're beginning to realize is put together the following kind of picture. I've been throwing out a bunch of sort of disconnected ideas out there, but we think the nutrition you get in fetal while you're still inside your mother, your infancy and childhood, the micronutrients you got, the contamination you got, the activity, the food choices, your obesity, adolescence and smoking and contamination again, and bit by bit you're accumulating risk for different kinds of diseases. And so your multiplication time of 9 months or 12 months, and those cells start becoming abnormal, and then a cancer finally becomes autonomous somewhere along the line. And so we go through a bunch of different stages. We talk about pre-initiation, initiation, promotion, and progression. I had to suffer through all 8 hours of this talk. I won't put you through that. But people are trying to look at those different stages and saying, what are the effects of different things on those stages? And we're going to go over pieces of that in a different way. But here's just some example about body mass index and weight. The more you weigh, the more likely you are to die from cancer. So for example, multiple myeloma, your chance is 144% versus somebody's normal weight. Colon and rectal cancer, 146%. Uterine cancer, 600% more mortality than from somebody of normal weight. So just for women, so what is it about being overweight that matters? Well, let's talk about that. We'll talk about that. So pop quiz. Cancer rates have been about the same in America for the last 100 years. True or false? False. Cancer appears to have the same incidence across societies. False. Dramatic differences. And this is why we argue about environment seems to be such a big issue. Cancer is mostly genetic in origin. I'm trying to beat this out of you. Okay. Cancers develop in 2 or 3 years, which is why you have to have screening exams that often. That strategy doesn't work. So very likely 20, 40 years. So here's where the biology is being looked at. I'm going to show you a few basic biology pictures to give you a sense of it. Our body has insulin receptors on it, and those insulin receptors on the surface of the cells, there's different kinds of insulin receptors. And cancer cells use those, but normal cells use those to turn on normal production of energy versus cell proliferation versus cell death. Those signaling. The more insulin you have, the more dysfunctional it becomes. So you have high insulin in you as we become heavier. Because when our cells are this big, they have 100,000 insulin receptors on the surface, so it only takes a few insulin molecules to work. But as we get bigger, our fat cells get bigger, and we still only have 100,000 insulin receptors on, which means those receptors are spread very far apart, so your insulin level has to rise. So your blood insulin level goes up. And insulin is a potent growth factor for cancer. And so what we find is when you go on calorie restriction, your insulin disappears. Insulin completely disappears when you go on calorie restriction. And we're down to exactly the genes that get turned off. Remember that mTOR that came along with animal protein? We turn off mTOR when you go on calorie restriction. Oh, we're getting down literally to the molecule, to the protein. All right? But here's even more interesting. Who knows what metformin is? Okay? Metformin is the most common drug in America for diabetes. So if I lower your blood sugar with metformin, it's the same effect as being on calorie restriction. Turns off cancer. It's lowering your blood sugar, but it also, metformin uniquely goes in and turns off this mTOR protein, so you stop cell proliferation, stop protein synthesis, increase cell dying. That's interesting. So what happens if we're overweight and we do something dramatic like have gastric bypass surgery? What happens when you have gastric bypass surgery?
Decrease.
You lose 100 pounds, okay? After gastric bypass surgery, look what happens to you. 56% reduction in coronary artery disease, 92% reduction in diabetes, 60% reduction in cancer. 60% reduction in cancer. So that sort of proves the point that losing weight and getting off of that high insulin growth factor and high glucose growth factor. So what happens if you lose 5 pounds? 5 to 15 pound weight loss has as much as a 50% decrease in insulin. So at any stage, at any age of anybody, even slender folks who lose weight, their insulin level goes lower and their risk of cancer goes lower. So if I take a couple hundred women, this is called the Zodiac study in Netherlands. If I take a couple hundred women who have stage 4 breast cancer, which means they're in trouble, they've got metastatic disease, and in 10 years, they're all gone. But of that group, a couple dozen of them had diabetes and were on metformin. And look at them. Look what metformin does to you when you have stage 4 breast cancer. So all my patients who have cancer that come to see me, I put them on metformin. And I'm in the awkward position of then saying, I've got to write to Medicare and say, well, they've got an abnormality of glucose because I think they're diabetic when their blood sugar is over 75. Medicare doesn't buy that. So we have issues. So I've got to, we have to be careful in how we do that. But I think actually it is a real abnormality. I want your blood sugar lower. America says normal blood sugar is above 85 to 100. And I say, that's not normal. That's making that cancer grow. So it turns out who is really at risk when you be out to being diabetic. And it turns out that it's not just being obese, being inactive in genetic predisposition and metabolically obese. So for those people who sit at computers all day long and look like normal human beings, and their body looks pretty good, but they don't have much muscle mass left, and their percent body fat is a little high, they turn out to be even higher risk than somebody who's overweight. So if a woman who can look pretty normal both sides, but she has no muscle mass because she's just not doing any physical activity, and she's at a keyboard all day long in an office or a computer, and not getting any exercise. So being metabolically obese, normal weight, turns out to have a higher risk for cancer than a person who is overweight but fit. So there's something magic about fitness that's unbelievably powerful. So I would rather you be fit, even if you're overweight, than be unfit. So we're going to disable all your cars tonight so you have to walk home. So everybody got to get a start here. Okay. So the implications of this are having indoor jobs at computers leads us to being out of shape. Lack of fitness means loss of fat and muscle. And metabolic syndrome is that complex of high blood pressure, cholesterol, higher sugar, inflammation, big waist, and increased risk for cancer. So taking a pill to reverse high blood pressure or diabetes isn't as effective for improving longevity as losing weight and getting fit. So in plain English, cancer cells grow with glucose and with insulin. Calorie restriction slows cancer cells. High insulin turns on cancer. Gastric bypass surgery reduces insulin resistance, reduces cancer. Weight loss reduces cancer. Taking metformin reduces cancer. And all this risk starts before you were born. So it's not a disease of 40s and 50s. It's a lifelong risk that we're all living in. So being metabolically obese, even with normal weight, is also a risk for cancer. And one more time, this is going through what I've just told you. And that bit by bit, high insulin turns on this cancer that's developing in early ages, and bit by bit that cancer becomes more bizarre and then it learns how to spread. So why is glucose a problem? I'm going to now drill down into why glucose is a problem. Back in 1932, Otto Warburg got his Nobel Prize. You need oxygen to burn glucose all the way down to carbon dioxide. In effect, the cancer defect is they forget and lose the ability to digest glucose properly. Where do you digest glucose in your body? Do you know? Does anybody know? Where do you burn glucose? What's the name of the power plants in your cells? Mitochondria. Okay, I'm going to show you pictures of mitochondria. So all cancer cells can do is ferment glucose to lactate, whereas normal cells oxidize it all the way to carbon dioxide. So maybe what that means is that cancer is not 500 different diseases, that cancer is one disease, and that is broken ability to digest glucose in 500 different tissues. Okay, so maybe it's the same disease in everybody. So maybe it's one common defect. The good news is, let's talk about taking advantage of that defect. So you've got to know your enemy. So our current chemotherapy basically gives poisonous drugs that block cancer cells' ability to rapidly multiply. What happens when you do that?
You kill everybody.
You kill everything in you too,
Yeah.
but almost all cancers have 4 or 5 layers of maturity of cells. And the chemotherapy kills layers 5, 4, and 3. But layers 1 and 2 that are the stem cells basically go to school and say, okay, so you're going to use this drug. Well, then I'm going to do that. And so the cancer comes back madder and more resistant. And when it comes back, it doesn't respond to chemotherapy. So all chemotherapy does is shrink it for a little bit of time, and then it comes back. And that's what we've been observing for the last 30 years. We haven't been making progress. So these drugs have overlapping toxicities in our bodies, and the advantage is they can be patented, and when they're patented, they make a whole lot of money for somebody. All right? But if you're the person paying $37,000 a month, that's pricey. So the disadvantage is they kill you too. And that's the problem, is they have lots of toxicity. And they don't kill all the cells, most importantly the stem cells that are growing slowly and not completely differentiated. So the human genome has enough tricks in it that the cancer cells go and borrow a trick and they find their way around that chemotherapy. All right? So let's go back to Otto Warburg and say, what does he do? He found out that cancers ferment gradually. They learn to compensate for insufficient respiration. That's what he called it. So here's your mitochondria. Here's a cell. Here's a normal cell with a nucleus and mitochondria. Now actually, your normal cells typically have about 200 mitochondria in them. Your heart cells have about 5,000. Your brain cells have about 5,000 mitochondria. And if I can make an analogy, if you look at a city, the energy of Milwaukee, where does Milwaukee's energy come from? The Oak Creek power plant, right? That's our mitochondria. So the mitochondria are your power plants inside your cell that are burning fuel, all right? If I take a normal cell and watch it multiply, it turns into a normal cell. If I take a cancer cell, it turns into a cancer cell. If I take the nucleus from the cancer cell and put it in a normal cell, what happens to it?
It turns into 2 normal cells.
It turns into 2 normal cells. Wait a minute, I took the nucleus, I took the DNA from the cancer cell and put it into a normal cell, and it stayed normal. That's backwards than what you were thinking.
Because environment is the issue.
No, because what's going on now is the mitochondria are passing on the property of it being cancerous. And mitochondria have their own DNA in them. So if I take the mitochondria, I take the nucleus from a normal cell and put it in a cancer cell and it turns into a cancer cell. Because your mitochondria have their own DNA, they replicate themselves. And they're broken. In fact, this is what they look like. A normal mitochondria should look like this, with nice ordered membranes. And that's where you burn glucose and fat all the way down. The only place you can burn fat is in normal mitochondria. And cancer cells look like that. So anybody who has cancer in them has some tissue that looks like this in their mitochondria. That's the power plant inside the cell. And they can't burn fat, and they can only burn glucose into to ATP, into lactic acid. All right? So one more time. Mitochondria are your internal power plants. They can multiply with their own DNA. They don't have DNA repair mechanisms, so when they break, abnormal mitochondria carry the cancer defect with them, making the rest of the cell cancerous. Cancer mitochondria can live without oxygen, but are very wasteful of glucose, needing a huge supply. Cancer cells therefore put out a ton of lactic acid, which alters their environment, making it more acidic, attracting more blood vessels, dissolving the tissue around it. If we alter the glucose supply, cancer cells can't make enough energy, opening novel new ways to attack cancer, aka metformin. All right? So Charlie Brown has to kick footballs. Cancer cells have to have glucose. What does Lucy do to Charlie Brown when he wants to kick footballs? So what should we be doing to cancer cells? Take away their glucose. So, pop quiz. Mitochondria are your internal power plants that normally produce your energy from glucose to a molecule called ATP. True or false? True. All cancers have abnormal mitochondria that cannot make ATP efficiently. True. Abnormal mitochondria injected into a cell, normal cell, can make it act like a cancer cell. True. Isn't this interesting? So this may address why we have novel strategies for battling cancer, attacking the energy defect of cancer. All right? So conclusion. The war on cancer stopped succeeding except for a few brilliant exceptions. Leukemias, lymphomas, just, we've got a couple. If I have Hodgkin's disease, I want chemotherapy. All right? Our current therapy models incentivize the current medical system to overdiagnose low-grade, minimal early tumors as aggressive disease and treat them with very toxic marginal therapy. And that's what we're seeing being done with breast cancer and prostate cancer. Cancer is a disease of cellular dysregulation. Cancer probably starts in childhood, if not in utero. A healthy lifestyle can prevent more cancer. Being overweight, particularly being metabolically overweight, and losing weight and limiting sugar may be strategies for battling cancer that are more useful in some of our current models. So what happens if you lower sugar? Let's talk about that. When you talk about, these are some of the things you can do. So Dr. Seyfried, the guy who did those pictures of the mitochondria, the most aggressive cancer is what? What's the most aggressive cancer? It kills people in 3 weeks. You've all heard about it.
Pancreatic.
Brain cancer. No, brain cancer. Brain cancer, everybody heard about somebody that, in 2 weeks they were gone, right? Oh, pancreatic cancer is pretty fast. That's a close second. But brain cancer is wicked. Brain cancer also turns out to be universally have the worst, most broken mitochondria. So what would happen if you now go see Dr. Seyfried at Yale University up in actually I went to Yale, so I know exactly where his lab would be. And so you go there and you go up to his lab and he says, I'm not a doctor, I can't teach you anything. He says, I refer people to Beth Zupik. She says, she's a nurse way out there in rural Wisconsin, somewhere way out there in this little town called Waukesha. That would be Waukesha. So I corrected him and thought that maybe he should get that straight. So Beth will come to your home and teach you how to eat a ketogenic diet. What's a ketogenic diet? It's a diet with no carbs because ketones come from breaking down fat. So Beth will teach you how to eat a high-fat diet. And what Beth has examples, for example, one person with brain cancer who's out 5 years from the diagnosis of brain cancer, no evidence of disease. And their blood sugar runs typically in the 60s and 70s all the time. All right? So what's a low glucose diet? Oh, I'm not going to go into this. I want to spend more time on other stuff. But fiber. Let's go into fiber. How much, anybody here particularly making an effort to eat more fiber? A couple people? Yeah, good. The average American eats about 15 grams of fiber a day. We evolved eating probably 70 to 100. When we have this kind of fiber in our diets, food transitions through us like in 1 day. Whereas if you eat 15 grams a day, it takes about 5 days to get through your gut. And if any of you would like to know what your own transit time is, go get some whole flaxseed, swallow it, don't chew too hard, and wait to see the flaxseed shows up when it comes out the other end. And if it's taking 5 days, You aren't getting enough fiber. If it's taking 2 days, you're doing a good job. Okay? But the human gut has a design flaw in it. And that design flaw is we make all our poisons in our liver. And our liver is way up here and puts bile out into the gallbladder. And the bile comes and empties right into our gut right there. So all of our poisons are put out into our gut at the very top of our gut. We then have 22 feet of small bowel and 8 feet of large bowel to reabsorb them. Okay, so all those poisons, all that environmental stuff, all the toxins we're living with, all the better living through chemistry, all the artificial foods and sweeteners and everything else we're eating, all have 22 feet to get reabsorbed. What happens if you're eating enough fiber? My grandma used to have a phrase, and the phrase went as follows. You can't move the freight if the train don't leave the station. If you aren't eating enough fiber, you're reabsorbing poison. So one of the most effective things we can do to detox ourselves, our natural detox system, is your liver. But your liver needs you to help it out. And it needs you to help it out by eating adequate fiber to get it out of you. So one example of that is what in medical school I learned about the enterohepatic circulation. And that's been really crafty. Your bowel reabsorbs bile acids, so it helps you make bile acids. So it's really useful because you can reabsorb them, reuse them. But if you reabsorb bile acids, then the amount of bile you have to secrete goes up because you reabsorbed them, which means the concentration in your bile goes up. And if the concentration goes up, what happens to gallstones? They precipitate out. So is there anybody here in this room who hasn't had their gallbladder taken out yet? Oh, that's okay. Wow, this is a good crowd. In America, we have huge numbers of gallbladder surgery. Guess how much gallbladder surgery they have in Central Africa? 0. Guess how much cancer they have in Central Africa? You saw the numbers. Go to Central India, go to Philippines, go to Thailand, and look at indigenous people living around the edges who are still eating lots and lots of fiber in their diet. And your grandmother and my grandmother and grandfather all lived on farms, and they had gardens out back, and they used to can, and they used to have vegetables right out of their garden, and they had a huge amount of fiber in their diet. We don't. We discovered Krispy Kremes and McDonald's, and we decided it was much easier, unfortunately. So as we've gotten older and gotten richer, and food gets so convenient, and the deli bar at Grosch's looks so tempting, it's just so much easier to get fast food that's easily made, that doesn't have much fiber in it. Okay? Does that make sense? So the EPIC study from Europe, for example, looked at the amount of fiber being eaten. This is the cancer study of all of Europe. And they looked at Switzerland and Germany and Sweden and England and France, all the Western countries, and they were all about 15 grams, just like America. And then when the European Union expanded, they added these 2 little countries called Bulgaria and Romania, which are filled with little tiny farmers with 2-acre farms, which are basically giant gardens, and they're too poor to have a pig or a cow or a car. And so they're working their gardens all the time, and they're eating 45 grams of fiber, and look how they fall off the cliff in terms of risk of cancer. Like 60 to 70% reduction. So if you're going to take vitamin D, find a fiber strategy. The most effective fiber strategy you can is eating lots of abundant whole vegetables. And short of that, eat a breakfast cereal every morning with 3 heaping tablespoons of flaxseed, ground flaxseed. Right. Every morning I have a breakfast where I have a tablespoon or 2 of quinoa, a cup of coconut milk, a cup of blueberries, and 3 heaping tablespoons of ground flaxseed. And that gives me 25 grams of fiber in 1 breakfast cereal. Okay. So in America, our data on fiber goes like this. Here's America's data. But you notice nobody in America eats over 40 grams. And there seems to be a cliff right there about 40. But nobody in America eats more than 40 grams. But even here, you have about a 40% reduction in America's data. So what's happened else in America that gives us more sugar in America? And I wanted to give you an analogy of, say, the food we eat compared to what our grandparents ate has been dramatically changed. And here's an example of it. Here's a whole grain. We discovered whole grains about 10,000 years ago when we were eating them just as raw food. And it's only 150 years ago we learned out how to make fine white flour. Okay, the glycemic index of this whole grain is 38. Okay, I'm sorry, here's 38. There's 25, that's 38. So here's whole oats. takes an hour to cook. Cut the grain in half, and it cooks in 30 minutes. And the glycemic index goes to 38. And does everybody know what the glycemic index is? Mm-hmm. That's how fast glucose gets into your blood. And cancers love glucose, right? So cancer cells, which are they going to prefer, this or this? Okay, so what happens if you run it through a little metal press and put it in a little cardboard box and call it quick oats, so it cooks in 3 minutes? What's the glycemic index this going to be? We've squished the fiber from protecting the grain. So your stomach enzymes could get to it. The glycemic index of this is going to be 65. The exact same food. This was discovered 100 years ago. 30 years ago, we discovered this stuff. And you put it in an aluminum packet with 3 fake blueberries, and all you have to do is add hot water to it. And the company that makes it has the audacity to say, healthy for you. What's the glycemic index of this? You put out insulin potently above 50. So when your blood sugar gets above 50, you start putting out what's insulin? It's a growth factor for cancer. But what's glucose? It's cancer food. Okay? So exercise, well, here one more time is basically the effect is the more you exert, the better off you are. In fact, even if you're overweight, the effect of being overweight, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but the fact is being fit, I don't care if you're overweight, if you're fit, because you dramatically reduce your risk by just being fit. So pop quiz. Exercise reduces the risk for cancer possibly by reducing glucose. True. Likely other internal shifts. It probably also reduces your insulin. It increases many other internal hormones properly. Processed food increases my risk for cancer. True. By raising the glycemic index when I showed you just the example of oats. Fiber lowers cancer risk. Certainly positive with colon cancer. Whole grains are better for me because they have fiber and lower glycemic index and don't tempt me to eat as much. True. If you eat grain at all. Okay. So alkalinity. How many of you have heard about alkalinity? Okay. What would be your interpretation of alkalinity? Who would like to give me an interpretation of what that means?
Cancer cells do not survive in an alkaline environment.
That's probably good enough. Vegetables, the biological ash of vegetables is a little bit of alkali. So after your body burns up vegetables, even lemon juice, if you eat lemon, put lemon water, after your body digests it, even though it tastes like acid, after your body's digested it, what's left over is a few alkalizing salts. The biological ash of animal is a little bit of acid because of the sulfur amino acids in there. Cancer cells love acid. It helps them attract blood vessels and dissolve the matrix around them. If you look at cancer cells, their pH is 7.2, whereas in normal cells it's 6.8 versus 7.2. Okay? So the more vegetables you eat, the more alkaline are, you're shifting all the buffers in your body. The more raw vegetables you eat, even more magnesium and potassium. As soon as you cook a vegetable, what happens? You break the cells and the magnesium and potassium salts leak out. Those alkaline salts leak out. So the more raw vegetables you eat. Now the evidence is relatively thin in terms of randomized placebo-controlled trials, but it's huge in terms of personalized anecdotes. So the problem is there's no money in it. It's very hard to do a research trial where there's no money. But what I see it as the organizing principle here is the amount of glucose in, well, what's the glycemic index of asparagus? Anybody know the glycemic index of asparagus? It's a trick question.
It doesn't have any?
No.
Oh, okay.
You can't get any. You need to eat 19 cups of asparagus to get 50 grams of glucose. It's really hard to find enough people who will eat 19 cups of asparagus. It's got so little free glucose in it. You have to eat this huge amount of it. So green vegetables, and here's my 50,000-foot interpretation. We mammals have been evolving for about 65 million years from the time of the dinosaurs, and we started out as this little shrew that was a vegetarian. We've been vegans up till about 3 million years ago when humans developed a huge brain, and we had to start eating meat to support this big brain. So for the first 62 million years, we ate plants, and we've only just the last couple of million years started eating animal. And so our basic core biology really runs off of eating plants. And so we're really designed to eat plants, and we just added meat in the last 100,000 years. So we're a bit of a mixed picture. So that's my interpretation. But conclusion, there isn't that much difference between plant and animal that you can't make up with 1 teaspoon of bicarb a day. In fact, there's evidence that if you take 1 teaspoon of bicarb a day, women, as they age, stop losing muscle mass and start gaining bone mass. So for anybody who has cancer, the first thing I tell everybody is you've got to find some way every day of taking 1 teaspoon of bicarb. I don't care how you do it. I don't care where you take it. I just want you to have 1 teaspoon, Arm & Hammer, just the orange stuff.
You can mix it with it like I do a Vitamix drink, doesn't matter. Just
Make it anything you want. In fact, if you put it in water, you'll hardly taste it.
Bicarb? What is bicarb?
Bicarbonate is an alkaline, it's alkalizing salt, and it just mixes, it sort of makes up for the acid we eat in our diet by alkalizing it. Yeah, baking soda. Arm & Hammer baking soda. The orange stuff. 1 teaspoon. Every day of the world. Just 1 teaspoon. But the ketogenic diet is more interesting. So let's just go about the ketogenic diet. So cancer cells like glucose, right? So to summarize, cancer cells love glucose. The ketogenic diet was found about 1920 at Johns Hopkins when they had a seizing child that wouldn't respond to anything. And they finally thought, well, the dietitian said, I'm just going to start feeding her just fat. And son of a gun, the kid stopped seizing. And there's a couple thousand children around America now who've been on the ketogenic diet. It's been around for 50 years. I have one in my practice. And I said to her, well, what's it like being on it? She says, it's okay. She says, good food, lots of tasty food. I said, do you ever eat any carbs? She says, I don't do that. So why? When was the last time you ate? She says, oh, about 10 years ago, I was at a party, and they were having cake, and I felt stupid not having cake, so I had a piece. And then I had a seizure. And then I lost my job because I couldn't drive. And it took me 6 months to get my license back. She says, I don't do that anymore. I need my job. So there's about a couple thousand kids living around America who eat nothing but fat. And she's eating, this particular woman's eating 90% fat. She actually has coconut oil she eats a lot of, and she eats a fair amount of salads and just huge amounts of olive oil on. She eats olive oil all over the place. But a ketogenic diet is a diet eating a whole bunch of ketones. Normal cells have normal mitochondria, and a normal mitochondria can burn ketones. But cancer cells don't have normal mitochondria, and they can't burn ketones at all. Period. None. They can burn glucose halfway to make 2 ATP, but they can't burn ketones at all. So if you start eating a diet made just of ketones, a small amount of protein, you're really giving that cancer a hard time. So let me give you one example, a couple examples, just a case. I have a woman in my practice who came to see me. She had bladder cancer. She was scheduled to have her bladder taken out. She was going to be 6 weeks away. What can I do? And I told her about the ketogenic diet and how cancer cells love glucose and all the rest of that. And she said, okay. She started. Got to surgery. Took a look inside her bladder. Couldn't find the cancer. So they canceled the surgery. And she came to see me just like yippee-yay, ki-yo-ki-yay. Another woman in my practice came to see me and was going to have her 1 centimeter nodule in her breast removed that looked like breast cancer, and her surgeon got appendicitis the day she had surgery. So he was off for 6 weeks because it took a while to get back, and she was in panic. She says, I need surgery. I said, find another surgeon. She said, no, I'm going to wait for my surgeon. Well, I told her about the ketogenic diet. She had about 1.5 centimeter nodule. Her blood sugar was 115. Tell me, what are you going to do when somebody's blood sugar is 115? That's too high, right? Put her on metformin. What else are you going to do?
Take away all sugar.
Take away her sugar.
Yeah.
And feed her what for breakfast?
Fat.
Bacon.
Yeah.
Okay, what are you going to feed her for lunch?
More fat.
More bacon. Right. Fat.
Coconut butter.
She's going to make bulletproof coffee. I told her about, how many people knows about bulletproof coffee?
You have to have
Oh, about a quarter of you. Bulletproof coffee. You take a cup of coffee, you put in a tablespoon of coconut oil, you put in a tablespoon of butter, you put in a tablespoon of whipping cream, you put in a teaspoon of cocoa, a teaspoon of protein powder, and a bit of stevia if you need a sweetener. Brrr, and your bullet.
How much weight are these people gaining?
They lose weight. like crazy
Even with all the fat.
because of all the fat. You can't lose weight eating carbs. You can only lose weight eating fat. And so they get skinny. And when they get skinny, their blood sugar goes down.
Is that similar to the Atkins diet where people were dying?
Pardon?
Is it similar to the Atkins diet, which was, Atkins was high protein, never mind.
Actually, Atkins diet,
What was protein, what was
No.
fat though? There was a lot
I don't want to get distracted.
Okay.
That's wrong, but we can argue later. Take away glucose and let the body get its calories from ketones is the point. Markedly downregulates the ability of cancer cells to grow, and you can't have too much protein because your body, if you get more than about 1.5 gram of protein a day in your diet, your body turns the extra protein into glucose. So your glucose starts going up. So if you have too much protein in your diet, you get glucose. But if you get too much fat in your diet, so there's multiple examples of cultures around the world, for example, the Maasai in Tanzania. And anybody ever been to Tanzania on safari? All the Maasai are all like 6'4". And they're all as skinny as rails. And you know what they eat? Every day, no, blood about once or twice a month. But every day they drink 7 liters of whole milk.
Oh, good.
That's their average. 7 liters a day of whole milk. 75% of their diet is cow fat, butter.
Raw whole.
And about once or twice a year they have cow, and about once a month they have blood, but every day they have 7 liters. So what did the Inuit used to eat? What did the Inuit used to eat in northern Alaska? 2 months a year, nothing but eggs. 6 months a year, nothing but caribou. And for those 6 months, what part of the caribou did they eat? The brains, the liver, the kidneys, and the fat, and they gave the meat to the dogs because who wants the meat? That's dog meat. That's dog food. They ate high fat, and then winter, for 5 months of winter, the Inuit ate blubber and fish, and their diet is about 90% fat. How many people have been to Fort Myers Beach or West Florida, Naples? Hadn't anybody been to Calusa or to what's the Ding Darling bird thing on what's the island is that on? That's on Sanibel Island. You ever been to the Ding Darling? Been to? Okay, at the very end, there's a little Calusa trail. You been to that? Okay. And when you walk around it, look carefully. You realize they've built the Calusa were natives who lived in Florida for some 4,000 years. Very little evidence of any vegetables. All they had for 4,000 years was oysters and clams. Oh, what a pain. Nothing but meat. In fact, high-fat meat for 4,000 years. Not a lot of vegetables grow in East Florida. There are multiple societies, about 30 societies we found, where humans have found eating high fat has been quite a safe and stable thing to do. But in terms of cancers, cancer cells can't live without glucose. So if you eat a diet of high fat, it can be wonderfully tasty. Butter tastes good. We like butter. We like eggs. We like bacon. What you can't eat is bread and carbohydrates. Because bread and carbohydrates turn on insulin. Insulin turns on cancer. Glucose turns on cancer. And you suddenly go, wait a minute. For the last 5 million years, humans have been living through winter. What do we eat in January? If you're a hunter-gatherer in Wisconsin, 500 years ago, what did you eat in January? Deer. Did you eat anything else?
No.
Well, if you could catch rabbit, you'd eat rabbit. If you could catch turkey, you'd eat turkey. If you couldn't catch turkey, you ate nothing. Right? So who made it through the winter? The people who got a little pudgy in September, or the people who kept their girlish figure in September? We want you to get a little pudgy in September, so we want you to get ready for winter. But in the winter, for 5 months, you ate nothing. That's what humans have been doing for the last 5 million years. We've been going in Africa 5 months of dry season, or in Asia 5 months of winter, and in Wisconsin 7 months of winter. At least last year. Was it 8 months?
8,
I lost track.
9.
I got so discouraged. We've been doing this forever. So what happens if you take 3 months and eat nothing but fat and ketones and meat? What happens to the cancer cells that are hanging on by your fingernails?
Dying.
You kill them off. I think if you're going to ever do a cleanse for yourself, spend a couple of weeks eating fat, otherwise known as a little bit of protein, otherwise known as rack of rib, with scrambled eggs for breakfast and bacon on the side. And you'll lose 10 pounds while you're at it. So that's the ketogenic diet. That is the ketogenic diet. That's the ketogenic diet.
Seeds and nuts.
Go to the oilery and get to be an olive oil snob and go buy beautiful, tasty, expensive olive oil. But it tastes so delicious, it makes you want to eat the stuff. Okay? So the ketogenic pyramid should be something like this. Now, what's wrong with this picture for a ketogenic diet? Here's a trick question. What's wrong with that picture? That's not a ketogenic breakfast.
Too much protein, maybe.
No? Potatoes.
Oh, good night.
Bonus, whoever it was. Okay. That's right. So here's Thomas Seyfried. He's the guy at Yale who discovered all the mitochondrial stuff. And I think he's now basically figured out at the molecular level what Otto Warburg described 70 years ago. Otto Warburg said cancer cells can live without oxygen, which means they can take glucose and break it in half. But that's all he could do. And now, with the ability of the electron microscope, Seyfried has looked at the mitochondria of cancer and realized that all cancers have broken mitochondria, which means they can't burn ketones at all, and they're really worthless. Their mitochondria are worthless. And the poor cell, all it can do, that poor little cancer cell, can only take glucose and cut it in half. Well, so take away the glucose and that poor little cancer cell can't survive. Okay, pop quiz. The ketogenic diet doesn't taste very good because it's mostly fat. Dramatically wrong. We like fat. Your brain has to have glucose to run properly. False. Decidedly false. Dr. Seyfried has shown that the most rapid of all cancers, brain glucose, can be tamed by taking away glucose. True. 5 years, no evidence of disease. The future of therapy for solid tumors might be metabolic more than chemotherapeutic. True. How about phytonutrients? What are phytonutrients? Perfect. And what's happened to plant nutrients in the last 100 years? What do farmers do? Does a farmer want to have a crop that's less productive, more productive? Do they want their apples to taste sweeter or sour? Do they want their apples to be small or big? Right. Those are the natural inclinations of all farmers. So for the last 5,000 years, if you do that, we've taken our foods and we've basically chased sweeter and better looking and more productive. So we've taken our Peruvian potato from this little gnarly thing with a glycemic index of 30 to a beautiful Idaho spud with a glycemic index of 95 and no phytonutrients in it. So we're now eating sweet Vidalia onions versus scallions. We're now eating on and on and on. So for example, if you give iceberg lettuce a value of 1 for phytonutrients, the number 1 vegetable in America is iceberg lettuce. The number 2 vegetable in America is French fry. The number 3 vegetable in America is ketchup. Right. Isn't this discouraging? So if you give iceberg lettuce 1, what's romaine lettuce going to be? It's power packed. It's like a 12. What's spinach going to be?
It's even better.
Like 18. What's dandelions going to be?
That's really good.
180.
Don't spray them.
Don't spray them. So this summer, at our church cleanup, when I was out there picking up all the little garlic mustard on the back of our church, we had if anybody wants to know a place where to pick great dandelions, we don't spray our church, and I promise there's huge numbers, big, tall things. So I picked must have been, 50 or 60 of them, and took them home and made it. That's kind of bitter, but enough good, tasty olive oil from the oilery, and wow, they tasted great. All right? So I grew up in central India. I went to school in the Himalayas. In the Himalayas, there's an apple called the apples came from Central Asia, and there's an apple called the Sikkim apple, about that big. And when we went hiking, we'd see folks drying these in the woods, and they're by their houses. I mean, out in the mountains. Do you know how many honey crisps it takes to make one Sikkim apple? 150. 150. If you're a cancer patient, make a point of finding all the crab apples you can stand eating, because crab apples are very close to the Sikkim apple. So you know all those trees by the Brookfield Public Library? All those beautiful trees, they've got crab apples about that big. They actually taste pretty good. Get in the habit of eating it, because one crab apple is worth about 70 other apples, because they've got the phytonutrients in them. And we haven't learned how to describe that, but yeah, so eat crab apples, eat purple potatoes, eat scallions. So what I really want is brightly colored, homegrown, primitive, non-GMO. Now, these plants have been the least modified. They've lost the least amount of their phytonutrients. So Brussels sprouts, broccoli, these are spectacular home run vegetables. They're also very high alkaline. But the phytonutrients in this something, but berries of all kinds, asparagus, these are all wonderful foods. But for example, shallots and scallions are like 10 to 20 times better than an onion. So you think you're eating a vegetable because you're cutting up a Vidalia sweet onion? You might as well not eat it at all. A Vidalia sweet onion is just worthless. It's got nothing but sugar in it because it's been bred out of it. Also, all the phytonutrients are gone. And if you want to read a great book, buy that book. Do you sell that book here, Dan? You don't. I have it in my office. I keep selling it out.
Green apples, do you feel are okay?
I think any of the apples we sell in the marketplace are probably a little suspect. But they're good. I mean, you're getting some alkaline effect. You're getting some alkaline effect. What she's done is she basically went through and looked at how all of our plants have been adjusted in the last 500 years to do what farmers do naturally, to make food look good, taste better, be more economically productive, and then we've lost all the phytonutrients. And the phytonutrients, I believe, is going to be a frontier that we've only just started to explore. And so people who come back and say, what was it, the diet from the Native Americans?
The Atkins or
No, the Native Americans. What was the Native American diet?
Oh, no, it wasn't a diet. The SEAC?
The cancer theory.
SEACT?
Yeah, see, I think there's going to be tons of things we're going to discover in the next 20 years, which we haven't learned to quantify and measure yet, that reflect the power and the strength of real foods that we used to eat. And those phytonutrients do something to our body's craving them. And so you see all these successful anecdotal stories of people out there who ate lots and lots of vegetables, but the vegetables can't be white onions and white potatoes. They got to be, you got the gist. And if you really want, come to my church and you get dandelions. Okay. So here, for example, how corn's been changed. This is what it started as. This is what it looks like today. Carrots started out looking purple. Yeah, when they came from Afghanistan, carrots were found in Afghanistan. The Dutch breeders living under the House of Orange find out, oh my gosh, orange carrots. So we think carrots should be orange. Actually, carrots are naturally purple. But this is what I want you to buy. Color. That's what an apple should look like, but we make it look like that.
Because people won't buy.
Exactly. People won't buy the other.
No, they won't. If a farmer is going to base his economic future
on that apple, they're
that
dead.
apple, it won't do.
He's dead. Right.
Exactly.
Go to the farmer's market on Saturday morning in Brookfield Farmer's Market and look what's selling.
Exactly.
I'm completely sympathetic.
Yeah.
But here's what, if anybody's ever been to Machu Picchu in Peru, anybody ever been to Peru? Okay. We went there about 10 years ago. The last time our kids went anywhere with us, if you pay, they'll come. But I was fascinated by the farmer's market. Oh my gosh, these farmer's markets shopping, there'd be 100 different kinds of potatoes. They all look like this.
Fingerlings.
And, well, they're just all different colors. These have all the phytonutrients in them still. That's the indigenous food. This is Peruvian potatoes. That's what we have in America now. And then this is a whole talk by itself. I can't go into pesticide. There's too much stuff about chemistry stuff. But there's some very dirty foods. So for those of you who haven't read about the Dirty Dozen, there's an awful lot of pesticides and an awful lot of foods. And I really believe the pesticides is another story that's going to be outlined in the next 10 years, and we're going to find it out. And if whatever it takes for you to detox, I think your detox should start with fiber, but I think there's also other ways of detoxing. There's some very, very good kits for and anybody who ever is inclined to start on any kind of diet should come and talk to Dan about Orthomolecular's detox kit. Yep. Have you got it here? Yep. Oh, good. Yes, and you've got ultra clear, implement. Yeah, so come talk to Dan about detoxing, because there's clear evidence that when you take the detox kits that runs you through a standard 7-day of diet, you can show the amount of gunk you're peeing out and pooping out increases dramatically. And you have a huge impact on getting rid of all this stuff that we accumulate in us. But there's some other tricks I thought just be fun to give you some insight into a few other tricks, and here's one of them. For example, cancer cells have to have a lot of blood flow. Okay? And to make blood vessels, you got to have copper. So cancer cells concentrate copper 5 times more than regular cells. That's interesting. What does Lucy do to Charlie Brown when he has to kick a football? If cancer cells need copper, what do you want to do for it? Take it away. So if any of you have cancer with you, want to look it up, you don't need to tell me what it is, but just look up cancer and decoppering therapy and look up your kind of cancer. What I'm doing in my practice now is it turns out most people have a blood copper level of about 35 to 40. Turns out there's a drug that's relatively inexpensive. Well, no, it's not relative. It's about $250 a month, $300 a month or so. But I can give you a drug that'll chelate copper and suck it out of you. And one of my faculty, Dr. Dwight McGee in California, says he now has about 250 women who've had breast cancer with a lymph node outside of their breast, which means they have stage 4 disease at diagnosis. And he says, I put them through chemotherapy and radiation therapy, and then I offer them being decoppered, which means for 3 years, they have to drive their copper level down to about 10. Which means they have to get a blood test every week, which means they have to have, it's a lot of work. They've got to get a lot of blood tests, and they've got to check their ceruloplasmin all the time. But he says, I have yet to have one woman who's turned me down, and he says, I should have had 100 relapses, and he has yet to have one. I think this might...
What foods are high in copper?
Oh, nuts, food, meat, ketogenic diet stuff, everything has lots of copper. Copper is everywhere. You get all the copper you need. I mean, the problem is it's very, very hard to be deficient in copper, unless you're eating a teenager junk food diet, steak escape with fries, with cheese on top. The teenage vegan diet, right. My daughter was a vegetarian, that's all she ate for 3 years. I'm sure she was copper deficient and everything else. But you can take copper away, and Dr. McGee, for example, has examples where he teaches of patients who've had CLL and have no evidence of disease for 15 years, of lung cancer that they'd given up on in chemotherapy, and he decoppers them, and the lung cancer completely went away when they'd given up on other chemotherapy. So decoppering a patient might be another metabolic trick playing on the sensitivity of cancer cells that they need to have copper because they need to grow blood vessels. So I'm just showing that as an example. The same thing seems to be with iron. Cancer cells need iron, and so we can there's some supplements that can help you remove iron, for example. Like artemisinin takes advantage of them when they've got iron in them. So conclusion, cancer takes years to develop accumulating skills or mutation, mostly caused by our lifestyle, sedentary, overweight, and borderline diabetic with lots of toxic chemicals. You can lose weight and exercise. You can lower your glucose. You can eat lots of fiber, avoid chemicals, limit animal protein, and start living a lifestyle or eating less refined carbohydrates and starving cancer with less glucose. If unfortunate to get cancer, the ketogenic diet may help. Plant phytonutrients may be central to all of cancer therapy. Metabolic management of cancer is likely the chemotherapy of the future for solid tumors. Copper, iron, glucose, ketones, but start with 1 teaspoon of bicarb a day. So one of my faculty is doing some of the following kind of things. This is one of his examples. Imagine taking a woman with a breast cancer with a big ulcer on her chest and putting her in a little heat tent and with an IV in and a Foley catheter in her bladder, and you heat up her body to 105.5 degrees or 106 degrees, and you give her a lot of Valium so she sleeps through it all. But while you're doing that, you give her blood sugar to 500. What happens when you raise your blood sugar to 500? What do the cancer cells say?
Hip hooray.
Right, hip hip hooray. So you're really revving the cancer cell up, right? And then with heat, you're making the cancer really rev, because then it's got to burn even faster, and then give 5 different kinds of chemicals that block the excretion of acid. So what happens to the acid inside the cancer cell? Sky high. So what does the cancer cell do? Dies. And 8 hours later, after doing it for 8 hours, you let her wake up, unzip the little tent, let her cool off, shake her head off a little bit, pee, take a leak. No chemotherapy, no toxicity, no drugs, no. And the next week her cancer is this big. And the week after that, it's this big. And that's again, so there's trying to be structured therapies that are being figured out to say, how can I take, now unfortunately we can't heat patients in America yet. So my faculty advisor in our program is saying, he's working with the Cancer Centers of America to say, can we use your clout in the marketplace to say we need to change the rules so we can start doing heat therapy in America. But my belief is that therapy should be soon in coming. So all the clients who are coming to see me in my practice say, my job is to keep you healthy and kicking and screaming until we're able to do heat therapy. Because I would love to start a heat therapy program.